Welcome to Being at Home with George during the time of COVID. And I'd like to start off by creating the possibility. We can create this possibility of embracing whatever comes up and at the same time generating hope. So today I'd like to talk about fear or working with fear. How can we embrace fear and at the same time generate the hope around it? How can we manage it? What is it and what's its impact? And so I think everybody knows what fear is. During World War II, FDR, the president, said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And so what did he mean by that? I take that to mean that it's the process of fear that we have to deal with, what impact it has on us, how it affects us. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is about this idea of being in survival mode. Growth puts us in survival mode so that we either fight, flee, or freeze. And so obviously there's not a lot that gets done when we get fear. It can actually paralyze us or can cause us to react to it in a way where what we do ends up causing more suffering, more confusion, more frustration. And so I like to talk about the idea of how to flow with fear, or what's the opportunity of fear. I believe there's an opportunity here in terms of how do we relate to the fear. First of all, knowing that we're in fear and how to work with it so that we get out of survival mode and we get into growth mode, or we actually get into being open and learning, understanding that we can get into growth mode and we can kind of look at things. We can look at what the fear is. And so it's not so much about the story of the fear, it's just the nature of fear. And if we can touch it, if we can embrace it, and if we can ask, what's the lesson and how do we relate to it in a way that empowers and moves us, inspires us. We know this from Selye. He talked about it in his book, The Stress of Life, that when we're under stress, that's when our latent abilities are able to express themselves. As a matter of fact, no struggle, no swag, I say a lot. So it's something here. And Frankl said that when we find meaning in suffering, it ceases to be suffering. And he also said that there's a way of finding meaning when we have unavoidable suffering. And the idea of that is, in that unavoidable suffering, in that space between stimulus and response, we can choose the attitude that we will have. We can choose to respond to it. We can have our attitude. We can decide to approach it with dignity and with poise by touching it. And this is what Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, is touching the fear. We learn from it. And when we touch it, in the same place the fear is, there's the peace, there's the ease. And so it's really more of a reaction to fear rather than moving into it. As Robert Frost talked about, the only way out is through. So what's the lesson? And so for me, I talked about this before, it's how do you work through fear? And one of the techniques that Frankl talks about in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, is what he called Paradoxical Intention. And so the idea is, when you're afraid of something, instead of running away from it, you move into it and you actually embrace it and you say yes to it. So what do I mean by that? I may have said this before, but when I started parking in public, because little is it known that I hated parking in public, and I wasn't very good at it when I first started it. In the company I was working in, we had this sort of on-site training called Speechcraft. And then I went from Speechcraft, I went into Toastmasters, and I remember I was giving one of my speeches, and I got up there and I was so nervous, I was shaking. And I didn't know how to deal with that. The more I tried not to shake, the more I shook. And so what happened was, I got through that particular talk, that speech, but then I reflected on, well, how am I going to handle it? Because I got another speech. I did my icebreaker. You have to do like 10 of them. And I was in graduate school at that time studying psychology, and specifically Viktor Frankl's Paradoxical Intention, his logotherapy. And one of the things he said was to embrace it. And instead of trying not to be afraid, I decided you go into it. So what I decided to do, instead of trying not to shake, I decided I was going to be a shaking fool. I was going to be the best shaker there ever was. And when I got up there and I did that, I stopped shaking. And so just think about that. That was probably 40 years ago. And so there's also this method called exposure therapy. So if I look at it, reflect on it, I just spoke many, many times over and over. And at some point, I got to the point where I wasn't afraid anymore. So little by little, increment by increment, day by day, step by step, I got a little bit less afraid. And by embracing it, now the fear doesn't fear me. So as FDR said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. So it doesn't really matter what the story is about the fear. What really matters is me being able to feel the fear. If I feel my chest, just be able to break it down to the level of bare awareness, a bare sensation, and just noticing this tightness and just breathing with it, breathing in, breathing out, and creating space for it, not running from it, that I'm able to get out of the story about it, why I'm afraid, what the specific thing is I'm afraid of, just being able to not get in the story about it, but just be on the level of bare sensation. So I'm not feeding the fear, and I'm just embracing it and noticing it. It's just a sensation that arises and fades away, that I can create space with it and be with it and rest in that. And then there's an ease and a peace, as Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, in terms of touching it. Right where the fear is, there's peace, there's ease. So when I make peace with the fear, it's no longer fear. And when I find meaning in fear, what's the lesson? What is it I'm trying to learn? How do I overcome something that I feel I have an idea how it's going to work, but in actuality, it turns out to be less dangerous, less stressful than I had imagined. And the actual thing itself is not as frightening as the idea of it. And so this idea of how do we embrace and working with fear, because there's a lot of it, and it's always there on some level. When we go into new territory, when we change a habit, we mobilize anxieties. And in this time of COVID and inflation, and then concerns about whether we're going to have a democracy and whatnot, or maybe not having enough food or not having the items we want. There's a lot of reasons for fear to manifest, but it's our job to embrace it, like I say, embrace it, say yes to it, generate hope, and say, there's an opportunity here. The only way out is through. If I find meaning in it, it ceases to be fear. So why not embrace it, be vulnerable enough to say yes to it and to grow from it? So in my speaking endeavors that I talked about, I grew from that. But there's many, many more opportunities that I had when fear arose, and I found myself in fight, flight, or freeze, and I can just breathe with it and get into growth mode by asking, what is this? What's the lesson? How can I relate to it in a way? And, oh, this is an opportunity for my latent abilities or me to ask questions. How do I do this? How do I deal with this? And actually, it's this idea of the roadblock becomes a stepping stone. And so I'm stepping up, and fear is an opportunity. So what opportunity does the fear as it arises in this time of COVID is available to us? And I think we've been talking about that. And the idea is, what's the technique? Create the possibility that whatever comes up, we can embrace it, say yes to it, and then generate the hope. Sometimes I refer to the hope as the Hall of Fame, hope, optimism, and faith, and say, okay, this is an opportunity for me to express my masterpiece, to express my divinity.